Today we are in Daniel chapter 5, and I appreciate Jordan's filling in for me last week, and he brought out the things that I wanted to bring out, but I've got a couple of other points I'd like to revisit before we get started. But very much I appreciated being away, and I appreciate Daniel filling in for me. And we're resuming our study with in this book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 5 this morning. Let's get started with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for every way that you've been mindful of us. We're thankful for this assembly, that we can come together here and be in your presence and to consider some things from your word. We pray that the time that we spend together here will be fruitful. We'll learn what you intended for us to learn, that we'll be given things in which to meditate, things to which to improve our service to you. We ask, Father, that you be with those that are separated from our group, maybe traveling, maybe ill, maybe hindered by circumstances beyond their control. We'd ask that those hurdles would be removed from their path, and that the hands that minister to them will be able to do the things that would be most helpful. They'll be able to join us again soon. Also ask, Father, that you would be with those that are not enjoying this privilege, those who would like to know more about you or are seeking you but are unable to do so because they don't know where to go, don't know how to start. We pray, Father, that wherever they live, wherever parts of the world that they're in, the lights that will shine from your servants, the Christians in the area, and help to guide them to places in which they can learn more about the God of the Bible and about the plan of salvation that you've laid out for us and the many blessings that you have in store for those that serve you. Forgive us of our sins, Father. In the end, if we've been found faithful, please give us a home in heaven with you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. A point that Daniel that Jordan did make about Daniel, chapter 4 last week, did involve the fact that this was a disputed part of history. This is the events of Daniel chapter 4 can't be found in nearly any other extra biblical references, and that's not altogether surprising. But many biblical critics, those who don't believe the Word of God to be inspired, that don't believe it to be God's message to mankind, look at this and say, well, this is just the Jewish scribes getting even with Nebuchadnezzar for sacking the temple. And that's not unprecedented in recorded history. Not just the sacking of the temple, but the people who were sacked writing disparagingly of the people that sacked them, that were on the taking side. And in fact, if you'll think about it, the temple of God had not been subject to any kind of distress since it was built. It stood in Jerusalem for nearly 400 years without being assaulted, and not being impaired in its operation. It was continuously operating under the same management, as it were, the priests and the Levites all tending to the services there. And so it was a pretty significant event to have the treasures of the temple taken away as booty, as just prizes from an attacking army. And they were used in ways that probably weren't used up to this point. It was probably at the occasion of using these vessels in Babylonia. This is maybe the first time that they were used, as written about here in chapter 5. But nonetheless, it's not unprecedented for people to take that opportunity to write in their histories ways of getting back, getting even with the folks that they want to disparage. And the narrative, as it's revealed in chapter 4, is one that's complementary to God, and so that's something that's kind of slanted in the fact that this was maybe a made-up story. And not being able to be referenced in in very many other works is a hindrance. But there are so many things about the book of Daniel and about the books in the Bible in general that are well evidenced, that are evidenced in science and in history and architecture that do still hold up to scrutiny and can be referenced in other places. That why should we discount this one because it happens to fit a narrative that critics seem to like? In other words, it's a reliable witness until it becomes an unreliable witness. It's given that the rest of the book of Daniel is reliable and the rest of the Bible is reliable. I see no reason not to take this as being a reliable account. Oftentimes, the writers of history don't include flaws or downsides. It's kind of rare, as a matter of fact, to get a warts and all kind of history like we see in the Bible about its kings, in which you read about one of the greatest kings in its history engaging in adultery and murder. And usually those things are glossed over. Those things don't be that's not a part of the posterity. That's not of any use to be able to record for future generations. Let's preserve the memory of our great King David. And so this is leave those parts out. And that's the way human beings approach it. And a great many times, the human beings, the histories are written by the victors, and so they tend to kind of fluff their leaders as being pretty fantastic people, and definitely glossing over the low spots. But the scriptures, the biblical history is different in that regard, as it gives you kind of a warts and all history, the good and the bad, of not just of its enemies, not just telling you how wicked the enemies are, but also the lapses in judgment of even its leaders. And so I say that even underscores the reason why we ought to believe it. Cynthia?
Well, also, many times things that have been criticized as being unrealistic in the Bible have eventually been uncovered as being true. So we can look forward maybe to some archaeological discovery that will show the truth.
But it wouldn't be surprising if the King Nebuchadnezzar's historian left this part out, because it's not very complimentary to Nebuchadnezzar as a great king and an able warrior, but rather and an administrator. It doesn't really fluff up his kingdom, make his kingdom look any better. But for us, it builds our faith, is that even King Nebuchadnezzar could fall. God can make an example of even King Nebuchadnezzar and the lengths that God is willing to go to get Nebuchadnezzar's attention. And why he didn't do this, why he didn't nip it in the bud, just at King Nebuchadnezzar's, when he put up the golden image and demanded everybody worship it. That'd be a nice time to correct his thinking. Seems like a good idea, but he had other things in mind. But one thing for sure, God was successful in correcting his thinking. I don't know what was on his mind during that period he went out and lived with the donkeys, but he wasn't thinking about how great my empire is, how great I am. Look at all my accomplishments. That he had some reasoning capability was evident, and eventually he came to his senses and began to seek and to wish to honor God, and God made this restoration. And Daniel even refers to that here in chapter 5. So that's all part of the story. Daniel, and subsequently in the book of Daniel, it's self-referential is underscoring that particular event. Anyway, I wanted to visit a couple of aspects of the historical account, and again, thank Jordan for filling in. Who is King Belshazzar? The very first two words in the book of chapter 5, verse of Daniel chapter 5 are King Belshazzar. Did you do any research on this guy, Glenn?
Grandson of Nebuchadnezzar through his daughter. So his father Nabonidus was the king as far as the empire.
That's exactly what. If you didn't hear that, Belshazzar was a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, or a descendant. Matter of fact, some of your versions may have in place of father and son, it may say successor or predecessor and successor. That I think that's probably what the literal meaning of the word. But in the context of the royal family, it would mean father and son, and it's often that the descendants of a king are all referred to as his sons, whether or not they're his direct sons or his grandsons or his great-grandsons. So they're still considered the sons of the king. Cynthia?
History suggests that the actual king Nabonidus fled Babylon when he heard that Cyrus was coming. And just a couple weeks before Cyrus got there, he escaped the city and left Belshazzar in charge.
That's entirely possible as well. He had at least one other previous absence that was recorded, again, by his historians, of where they were at least co-regents, and Belshazzar ruled in his stead. And so he's at least the crown prince, if not the co-regent, if not actually, as referred to here, the king and the queen, with the actual king being offside, perhaps fled with the coming of Cyrus. And that's another good point here, is this is happening by the events that's described here at the end of the chapter. This is happening in the fall of 539 BC, because it's right on the eve, practically, of Babylon's being overtaken. Now, the Medes and the Persians moved into Babylon. They didn't just move in and tear it down. They didn't destroy it. They moved in, took over, and just resumed operations. But this was not where their heart was. They had another palace and capital elsewhere in the Medo-Persian Empire. They didn't move in and take over and resume operations as being the world power from Babylon. Babylon was just another one of their holdings. But they did sack the city. Were able to take it over. And in fact, Belshazzar dies in pretty short order. And Nabonidus, his fate may have been exactly the same if he was on site. But if he was off site, if he had fled the coming armies, then that would have put him no longer being king there as well. The Belshazzar, that there's been a change in administration, is also suggested by the fact that that the king and the queen anyway has heard of Daniel, but the king hasn't. Belshazzar doesn't know about Daniel. And Daniel, if you remember, was elevated being the chief of the counselors. He was Nebuchadnezzar's chief counselor. He was his right-hand guy. There's practically no one in the kingdom that enjoyed as much influence as Daniel did in terms of his access to the king and his place in the royal court. And so with the passing of Nebuchadnezzar, it doesn't mean that they completely cleaned house and kicked everybody out and started all over again. Many of those officials continued to be in their same function for the new king, especially since it was in the family. Nabonidus was, I think it's generally held, he had married the oldest daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And so made something of an argument for being the most qualified to take the king's place, as opposed to one of the king's actual sons. So anyway, that's the Belshazzar is a co-regent or a king. He's referred to here as a king. He's the one in charge at this particular point, and he enjoys very great influence. And a matter of fact, something is to be said by the fact that when he sends out his call for the interpretation of his not a dream, but the events that occur here at this feast. The prize is this royal robe and a chain of gold and the third place in the kingdom. And so if he could offer that as the second place guy, he could say that whoever comes and solves this problem for me will be second only to me in terms of rule in the kingdom. That's part of the incentive for solving the problem. So that also fits in the picture of him being the second in charge, or at least a co-regent. So that's kind of sets the stage here. What does this king decide to do at this point in his career? In verse 5, he made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. So threw a big party in his honor, apparently. Again, I know that you're shocked to see, an ancient king behaving in this fashion, but this is the kind of lives that kings lived. That they were the top, they were the highest, the final word and the highest power in the land in their eyes, and they pretty much did what they wanted. Now, when a warring kingdom came up, another king that was raised and thinking about, and has the same world outlook, and says, I don't like the way things are going. I don't like the way things are being run in Babylon. It's time for a change of administration. They might, they might have a differing idea of what would be what I want. But basically, the king doing what he wants is pretty much the job title. And Belshazzar is doing this exactly. And in addition to this, he decides to amp the celebration up some. Not only is he having a big wine drinking party for all of his lords, thousands of them in attendance. He decides to bring out the good stuff, to bring out the vessels that were taken from various temples and such, including the temple of the Lord, and perhaps more prominently the temple of gold and silver that it mentions specifically that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple. I suspect that there wasn't enough of those to go around even for the royal party, which it appears are going to be the ones that are going to be using these vessels. There's not enough of those to go around. And so he probably brought some others from other temples as well. But he decides that, again, this is all my stuff, and I can use it the way that I want to. And that was pretty much the end of the argument, the beginning and the end of the request. And so he sets out to bring those vessels in, had been taken in, verse 4, been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines began drinking from them. And they not only were drinking from these vessels that they were not entitled to, that were not were created without that intention, they were intended just for use by the priests and the people in performing priestly duties before God. Not only that, in verse 4 rather, they praised the God of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. And so they were, I mean, what else could they do to offend Jehovah? I guess they could have used them to dig in the dirt or something, but even that might not have been as offensive as using them in praise of idols. The affront to God, the God of Daniel, the living God, the only God, to bringing these vessels out and having them handled by people who were heathens, who didn't believe in him, just as common kitchen implements to eat and drink from, and in further to drink and to raise toasts or to praise these false idols that couldn't. And Daniel goes on to describe them. They aren't capable of seeing, hearing, or doing anything. And so you've brought great shame. You've made a great affront to the Lord at this point. In verse 5, it says immediately, or almost at the very beginning of doing this. I don't get very far into this process, this celebration, before a sign appears. Can you describe the sign to me? Is it a vision? Hazel?
His hand was writing on the wall.
The fingers of not just a human hand. And so an apparition, maybe. Perhaps it was a physical manifestation of it, disembodied hand began writing on the wall. I know some of you are of an age where you've heard the phrase, the handwriting on the wall. And I expect that this is where it came from. This is where at least most English-speaking people probably have recognized it from, even though they may not remember that they've heard the story before. What does it mean if a person is able to read the handwriting on the wall? Cynthia?
It's an omen.
Okay.
A predictor of the future.
A predictor of the future. And what that usually means, if you were talking about the CEO of a company or somebody in your family that was one of the matriarchs or patriarchs in your family that was a pretty sharp guy, and he could read the handwriting on the wall. What does that usually mean? That's how I've been given it's an omen. What does that mean about that person's discernment? Which, the way we use it anyway, is that they're pretty sharp. That they can put together a picture without having to be told having it be explained to them. It doesn't mean that they're prescient. It doesn't mean that they can see the future. But it kind of means that they can make deductions. They can make extrapolations based on the evidence that's presented to them here at hand. And so we think of them as that's something that's pretty sharp. But in fact, that's something that Belshazzar couldn't do. Why is that, do you think? What about the language that was written? I think it was in the language that they spoke, but it may have been in a dialect that the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, didn't traffic in. And it could be that it was one of the assimilated languages that had come along. It bears the words bear some similitudes to several different types of languages, although they do bear the same. They're very close to the Aramaic equivalent of the words that Daniel eventually translates. So there could have been a language barrier, but I think probably the king was more spooked by just the fact that this apparition, this disembodied hand, began writing on the wall, and it left the message there for all to see. And presumably, not just the king saw it, but the king and the queen, and all of his courtesans and the people in the room saw it as well. So what's Belshazzar's reaction to this particular event? Okay, it mentions that he was greatly alarmed. And that in verse 9, that his color changed and his lords were perplexed. And this is at the point where they're actually seeing this thing, this thing being undertaking. His thoughts in verse 6 alarmed him. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. A lot of physical evidence of the fact that the king is very disturbed by this. And he calls loudly for his counselors to come in. This, again, mimics the behavior that we've seen before when the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 4, he goes straight to Daniel. He cuts right to the chase. But in the initial, when he's not necessarily first introduced to Daniel, but Daniel introduces or first demonstrates this power from God of being able to interpret these dreams, he sent for all of his counselors. And they came in, and if this was just in ordinary Chaldean language, they still might not have understood really what the message was. But it seems, Daniel's interpretation seems to be pretty plain, don't you think, later in the chapter? It doesn't seem like if it was in the language that everybody in the room spoke, that if they would have been too perplexed about it, other than the fact that it was nearly unthinkable. After all, they were a world power, and the Medes and the Persians were just some upstarts. They were enjoying some success, but they would, in the minds of the Babylonians, would never be as great as Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom. Joanne?
My footnotes say that to give a definition of each of the words that is actually somewhat vague. Like the first one is numbered.
Yep.
So that who knows what's numbered or what, so it's Daniel who knew what God was telling him because God told it and gave him the info, but the language could have been plain without the meaning being understandable.
That's true, and exactly what it meant, obviously, would require some interpretation. As well, the fact that it's still a supernatural event. So it is a message from the gods, from a supernatural being. And exactly what it meant in saying numbered, weighed, and the Persians, it might not have been very clear. And so the desire to know very specifically what this particular message meant and why it was delivered in this way at this time to this person would have been part of the interpretation, I think, as well. But it definitely shook Belshazzar up. And maybe everybody, maybe the rest of the people in the court as well. But Belshazzar mentioned several times about the physical manifestations of his fear and his color changing. More than once it mentions that. So it definitely had a deeper impact on the king. And maybe it's that guilty conscience. You know, sometimes when you're, get caught doing something you shouldn't do, and like taking these vessels out of the treasury and using them at dinner. Maybe he felt like he has had his hand caught in a cookie jar, and there was going to be some bigger consequences of that than he imagined at the outset. That could have been all indications of that. As a result, and it is that it's interesting here that none of the counselors are willing to offer a possible explanation. Is that ultimately they have to, after counseling together, they realize that they don't know. They might understand the numbering and maybe even the weighing, but why? What about the Medes and the Persians? And exactly what all of that meant, and be able to put that in satisfactory terms to the king. None of them are willing to or able to offer this, even with the inducement of a very powerful reward of being third in the kingdom and being dressed nicely and wearing a chain of gold. The queen brings the king's attention to Daniel. And Daniel, at this point, if this is indeed on the eve of the fall of Babylon and the fall of the autumn of 539 BC, how old do you think Daniel would be at this point? As an old guy, I can tell you he was an old guy. He was in his 60s, very likely. Given that, he's probably about 15 when they took him away from Judea. And many years have elapsed at this point. He's an older guy. He's continued, I believe, to enjoy the benefits of the fact that he was in the king's court. And I think he's continued to be treated well even after Nebuchadnezzar and the various successors that Nebuchadnezzar had. And there were some of his successors whose reign was measured in months. I mean, being being king may seem like it's a pretty good gig, but generally you have to worry about the people in your family who want your position, as well as your enemies who want your position, as well as those people that are outside of the country that want all your stuff. I mean, it was not although a very privileged position, it's not without its hazards. And so with those changing of guards, Daniel might have had the opportunity to have been displaced, but I'm thinking he's still being pretty well treated. But notice he doesn't appear to be in the initial call for the counselors. He's not in Belteshazzar's inner circle, even though he was his grandfather's, very, very likely, but his Nebuchadnezzar's favorite or his top counselor. Daniel doesn't appear to occupy that position here. And the queen has to bring into mind, remind the king of having Daniel as an asset so that they eventually send for him. He's also described in verse 12 as having an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So this puts up the occasion of Daniel being introduced into the king's court and given the opportunity to provide this particular translation. It doesn't. My feeling, my interpretation of this, my reading of this is Daniel is not happy to be here. He is performing his duty as been prompted, as holding this gift from God and making this interpretation. He doesn't, I think, delight in bringing the king the interpretation, even though it's bad news for the king, and there may have been some personal dislike between them. The occasion of his being in the court is not one that he would view, I don't think, with very much pleasure, especially when he saw that that he understood that the occasion was as a result of these implements being taken from of these temple dishes being taken out of the treasury and used for dinner for the king to celebrate and to honor his idols. When Daniel offers the interpretation, what is the interpretation that Daniel gives? Tim?
That basically the king had been found wanting. His arrogance was there like Nebuchadnezzar, but Nebuchadnezzar humbled himself. Belshazzar did not, and the kingdom was going to be stripped from him, given to the Medes and Persians.
Again, I don't know of any way that someone without supernatural knowledge would be able to make this assessment. Particularly that who was eligible to offer an acceptable or a convincing judgment against the king? The king was, in all of these countries, the king was the top guy. He was the guy that set the rules. So who watches the king? Who is fit to be able to judge a king?
God.
Only God. And so it isn't actually stated in the same way outright that the Chaldeans, the wizards and the counselors don't say only a God can interpret this, but the stage is kind of set in a similar way to Daniel chapter 2, don't you think? Is it really, if these assessments are an evaluation of his rule, numbered, weighed, the Persians, if that's in fact a commentary, an assessment, a judgment being rendered on his rule, that only a God would be able to offer that. And in fact, that's the most natural explanation to a disembodied hand writing on the wall. And so the stage is, Daniel's called in, and I don't know when God gave him this message. Maybe God appeared to him in a vision and explained the situation to him before he was called. Or maybe it's something that God told Daniel he was going to do, and that he would be drawn in before the king to offer that explanation, and he should do so with a reminder that God is in fact the God of kings. But that's the occasion here for Daniel begin answering here in verse 17, where The king ends after giving his demand to him and says, if you can do this, you'll be elevated to the third place in the kingdom and be well dressed with a chain of gold. And Daniel's answer to him in verse 17 is, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nonetheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. He starts off by giving the praise to God and calling, in fact, that God was, in fact, the God of Nebuchadnezzar. Whether Nebuchadnezzar agreed to it and acknowledged it his entire life or not, God was the God of, and is the God of Nebuchadnezzar. And it's that God who's actually sending this particular nation, or this particular message to him. Because of God's greatness, he gave to Nebuchadnezzar all peoples, nations, and languages, and he sat in a position of able to exercise his will, even though the King Nebuchadnezzar seemed to be the most powerful voice in the land. Having set that stage, he then calls to mind the events of the 4th chapter and reminds Belshazzar, and the folks within earshot, of the fact that even as great as Nebuchadnezzar was, and as great a blessing of God that God gave him in humbling all these nations before Nebuchadnezzar, nonetheless, God humbled Nebuchadnezzar. And for a while, he lived as a wild animal. He's driven from among the children of mankind in verse 21, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwellings with the wild donkeys. And he goes on to talk about the fall of Nebuchadnezzar as far as how God got his attention, how God eventually got his attention. And yet Nebuchadnezzar eventually came back to acknowledge the God of the true God. In verse 22, though, that stands in stark contrast to Belshazzar. Belshazzar doesn't appear to have given any acknowledgement to God during his reign. Any kind of mention, and even up to and including the events of the evening however, that particular evening, I think the handwriting probably persisted on the wall, and it probably took some time to summon the counselors and then for the queen to remind the king, or Belshazzar, about Daniel, and for Daniel to be located and come. So some days may have passed past the evening in which the handwriting appeared on the wall. But nonetheless, in that time, there's been no acknowledgement, no humbling of himself. He's afraid, but he's giving no honor or giving no recognition to anyone or to whoever is going to be able to make this deliver his request for an interpretation. And he says, and you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. The vessels of his house you have brought in before you, and you have praised the gods of silver, of gold, of bronze, of iron, wood, and stone, who do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, whose are all your ways, you have not honored. And this is the real message of the handwriting on the wall. The actual interpretation he's going to get to, but he's saying in the whole of this, the thing that you perhaps aren't, and you're being troubled by this handwriting on the wall, you're overlooking the more important issue, is the fact that you haven't given any honor to the one true God. Unlike your father, unlike Nebuchadnezzar, unlike your predecessor, your ancestor, you haven't come to acknowledge God in his true capacity. And so as a result now, then he gives the actual translation, that God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. That you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and that your kingdom is going to be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. It's perhaps apparent to the people paying attention to the political scene that the Medes and the Persians are an aspiring force to contend with. I've already mentioned the possibility of the actual king having fled the city in anticipation of its being conquered. Excuse me. And so there could have been some indications that this is what the message was about up to this point. But Daniel removes those at this point. He steps in and provides the explanation And it's not one that's very, very favorable that and I don't believe that Daniel takes any delight in delivering it to the king. Tim?
I think that Belshazzar's reaction to this is one that either because of his state of inebriation and didn't sink in, but he goes ahead and places Daniel over a third of the kingdom of a kingdom that's basically worthless. It's done.
Except for the fact that the people that are in the royal court usually have some overlap.
Yeah.
You know, they don't, usually the attacking armies don't come in and install commanders, but the actual governors and such actually show up later on. And so his position that Belshazzar at least honors his commitment to the interpreter of the dream is notable in his character. It may have actually be an indication of his rethinking things, of taking to heart the message that Daniel had. And maybe he didn't know about Nebuchadnezzar. He may not have actually been alive at the point when Nebuchadnezzar had his time away from the kingdom, his sabbatical. And so it's possible that he hasn't taken that he didn't know about that, and he didn't take it into account. Again, I don't think it was part of the general history. The family probably knew about it, but it probably isn't something they talked about at feasts. As a result, his kind of a dive bombing of an education here of this particular occasion is one that was pretty significant. The very night in verse 3, and he made a proclamation about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. But as it says in verse 30, that very night Belshazzar the Chaldean, the king, was killed, which now means Daniel, second in the kingdom. You know, if you're looking at a session like that, that's a very quick promotion. But in fact, with the Medes and the Persians coming in, it was a chaotic and terrifying experience for the people in Babylon. To go from being the seat of power to being the capital of the prominent world power, and to now being a vassal. And so this changes things, but it appears historically that Daniel is here. He's being about that he was. It mentions an incoming ruler, Darius the Mede, who's the subject of chapter 6, and he actually takes over the kingdom. And like Daniel, is an old guy. He's being 62 years old at the time, and so that changes things. It changes the situation inside of Babylon. But on literally the eve of the change, we see this demonstration of God's power that reflects back to the dream, the vision, the interpretation that Daniel gave to King Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4. And this is among the stories that children's Bibles and such, they don't relate these stories. They relate the stories in the preceding chapters. They relate the stories in chapter 6, for instance. Those are usually in those Bibles. But they don't, many Christians, many people that aren't familiar with the book of Daniel aren't very familiar with how these visions are interlinked. But they are in fact interlinked. They may remember the handwriting on the wall story, but don't know the story of the felling of the great tree. But they're actually presented here as part of the same body of evidence. The same that event is actually referenced here as explaining to Belshazzar about why he's going to enjoy the fate that he is. In considering this particular lesson and the reinforcement of the previous lessons, what benefit do you think we have in these being recorded for us in this record? Why include? There's lots of years, lots of opportunities, lots of other events that most likely occurred during these times about Daniel and his companions that could have been included as part of this history. But why include? Do you think it's this supposition? Why include the previous lesson about Nebuchadnezzar's fall and restoration, and Belshazzar's ultimate demise?
It's a warning.
Certainly a warning. What kind of warning?
Things to come if you don't.
Joanne?
Nebuchadnezzar did it right. They should follow his example. He also, Daniel claims, in talking to Belshazzar, that Belshazzar knows of that event. So Daniel may have just assumed he knew, or if it was family history, or he may have actually known.
That's true. I didn't accede to that. I didn't make that particular point. It is he makes known. He does kind of explain it to Belshazzar. This may not have come to mind This may not have been what you were thinking about, but I'll remind you that you knew about this. And it was available to be known, but I've kind of alluded to the fact that both of these here are showing God's role as judge. That even over the king, even over those who make the rules, those who make the law, and everyone has to follow their word because it's their word, God is in fact judge over them. He's not just the judge over the common people, not just the judge of the people sitting in the pews. He's the judge of the leaders. And he exercises his power at his discretion. There is a lengthy pronouncement in Jeremiah, near the end of Jeremiah, about Babylon and Babylon's fall. And it's not gonna remain a prominent city. I think you can still go to the ruins of Babylon even today, but nobody lives there. And it's kind of a choice spot. It was not necessarily had a bad history. You know, you would think that the subsequent, if it was a good city to live in at one point, that it would be useful as to live there for people to live there as time goes on, even with the changing of kingdoms. But in fact, it's largely unoccupied today. There's a story of a visitor to the biblical lands in the last half of the last century who had to hire somebody to take him out to see the ruins of Babylon, because the fact that the rumors are, of course, that it's haunted, and it's a place that wild animals live. It's just a wreck. Cynthia?
If I'm remembering correctly, one of the means Cyrus used to conquer the city was to dam and divert the river that provided the water for the city. And that was never really restored, that the local water source is gone, and that's why the city is abandoned.
I remember references to that as well, as using the water system, like David did when he took over Jerusalem. This was more of a sacking. This is much more of a military occupation and displacement, and the fact that the local water source may have been compromised, so not being able to continue to supply water to the city would certainly make it more difficult. But someone could go and undo that, restore it back to its original tracks, if they took the initiative to do that and saw the value in it. There's a lengthy description about God's outpouring of wrath to Babylon, about his setting right the scales of Babylon, even though you may remember when we introduced our study in Daniel, Jeremiah also referred to Nebuchadnezzar as my servant, and as a message from God. God says, my servant Nebuchadnezzar is going to administer justice in Judah. And that was just as fantastic to be able to hear about as the eventual sacking, eventual destruction of the city of Babylon. So certainly God's role as judge and God's role in using even the individual kings of a particular kingdom to accomplish his will, I think is one that would be a clear message. Again, this is one of those chapters that was written in Aramaic, and it's not specifically directed to the Jews. It's written in Hebrew. But this is a message to the modern world at the time that Daniel's writing it about the nature of the true God. And the stressing in both of these cases about giving God his homage as a living God. And God, and the way Daniel here describes here is that you got all these gods that you've made out of all these different, everything you could think of to make gods of, and they can't see or hear or do anything. They're worthless. They're not, in fact, gods at all. And that's that's Daniel's preamble that he puts in place, is that I need to tell you that so I can tell you this, is that this isn't just some kind of a happenstance or a whim of God who's incapable of delivering on his promises. This is the message to Belshazzar from the living God, the one true God, the God that is judge of even gods. And that this is the end of the road for you. He didn't actually say that he's going to be killed that night, but that's in fact the way history turned out. His kingdom was taken away from him violently. The author asked about practical warnings against drinking alcohol that you could have for this. And this is a general paint. You can paint this event into general paintbrushes. Yeah, alcohol is, after all, a drug. And drugs have side effects. And impairments of your judgment from drinking alcohol is not something that should surprise anyone. It's well documented. And this is an example of just how bad of judgment that you can make when you're when your judgment is impaired, I guess this is before they had the "Know When to Say When" campaign that the people who make alcohol in North America came up with sometime late in the last century. The know when to say when. So while you're impairing your judgment, know when to stop impairing your judgment. That really doesn't have a very good ring to it. But in fact, the fact that these events were triggered for Belshazzar on a fantastically bad judgment that he makes. Not the throwing of the party, but I don't see even the wildness of the party, but the amount of libation that was consumed and the resulting bad decisions that he made brought this to a head and caused him several bad evenings as a consequence. But the real takeaway, I think, about this weighing and the balancing is that this is the role that God has promised all of mankind to weigh and balance us in the measure of our life. Not that we're going to merit his attention, but rather he's going to take into account, and particularly our attitude toward serving him as a measure of judgment for all mankind. The folks in the pews, the folks that are leading, the folks that are governing, the folks that are leading armies, that all mankind is going to be subject to this kind of a judgment. And with that, that's the lesson.